Wow, what a way to start a new season. I'm not going to lie to you guys, I was a bit uneased when I saw the tweet saying that the finale of Season 1 had run into some sort of vague issue that prevented its release, and that Viv and her team were instead just moving on to Season 2. I feel like this tweet was kind of downplaying the importance of what was actually in Episode 8, since season finales are usually pretty important, but I have literally nothing to back that up. That's just a personal feeling I have. Anyways, I give this studio massive credit for managing to crank out an episode that was this good, given the obstacles they had to work around here. The fact that this came out as good as it did just goes to show how talented the studio behind this show actually is. This episode was, in my opinion, an extremely lore-heavy episode. Seriously, I had to break out the red string and thumbtacks to figure out how all this shit fit together in the end. I think I did a pretty good job, but if I messed up along the way somewhere and start spouting nonsense, please don't hesitate to tell me in the comments. The thing that made this episode so complicated was the fact that almost all of it takes place in the past. It's a backstory episode which jumps around in different places in time, which is what made this all so hard to track. How do I feel about the fact that this was a backstory episode? I'm not sure if it's the best way to start off the season as a whole, but I think I need to see more of it to make that call. Either way, it's very far from being bad. Characters are more fleshed out and further developed. The Goetia marriage subplot is massively expanded upon, which everyone's been waiting for since episode 2. We get to see some of Blitz and Stolas' home lives, which gives us more exclamation for how they became the people that they are now, and we get to see a bit of Vizarali and Blitz's past friendship, which was foreshadowed in the last episode. That's a lot of new information for one episode. However, they did make the episode significantly longer to accommodate all that. It clocks in at 23 minutes, making it the longest episode of Helluva Boss yet. Honestly, I'd expect no less given that this episode took the length of a fucking pregnancy to come out. I'm still peeved about that wait time, by the way. I mean, I get it. The independent studio, technical issues, blah blah blah. But just because there's an understandable reason for the wait doesn't mean that I have to like the delay. Anyways, as I was saying, the lore heaviness of this episode doesn't make me dislike it or anything. The episode is great, even if it's a bit complex. So let's dive into this episode and pick apart all the lore intricacies I've been rambling about for a couple minutes now, as well as what makes it great. The plot of this episode does something very different from all the other Helluva Boss episodes. As we know, this is a past episode, so it's showcasing events from different points in the past. It bounces around a little bit, first showing us how Blitz and Stolas met and became friends, which apparently happened when they were young kids under strange circumstances, which I'll elaborate on in a minute. It shows us how they went from friends to sexual partners, which happens a bit fast and out of nowhere, and I have other problems with it, but more on that later. And finally, we get to see what's happening in the present, which is probably the most informational and expository part of the whole episode. Yeah, this whole episode really is just one big lore dump that also fleshes out Fizz, Blitz, Stolas, and Stella. Hell, the entire rest of the IMP isn't even here. That's not to say that the episode is bad, though. It's still entertaining, and I feel like it was almost necessary at some point. Helluva Boss is a show that has a lot going on outside of the stories each episode tells individually. There are a lot of things that are established throughout the episodes that create several overarching threads. Like Stolas' familial problems, which include his wife trying to get him fucking assassinated, Stolas' relationship with Blitz, Blitz's family, Blitz's past life at the circus, and Blitz's relationship with Fizz, which eventually all soured and caused him to abandon that life. Then there's also the endless amount of speculation about the rest of Stolas' family, and how the Goetia family and Grimoires work. That's just a ludicrous amount of stuff, and that's not even all of it. So because of that, I think an episode that elaborates on at least some of that had to happen at some point. Everything that's been disclosed so far raises too many questions to not go anywhere meaningful with them. Like I said before, I don't know if it was the best choice to make this lore dump episode the first one of the season, but I feel like it wasn't done unintentionally. There's a possibility that it might actually be a sign that Season 2 will be allocating more of its time to the unanswered questions raised by the show, as opposed to the more comedic, simplistic antics of the IMP. I feel like the best way to continue reviewing this journey through the characters' pasts would be to go by segment between time jumps as opposed to the beginning, middle, end format that I typically use for these episode reviews. So let's dive headfirst into this lore rabbit hole. Alright, so the first segment of this that we get is of Blitz, Stolas, and Fizz's kids. This is where a lot of that home life development I mentioned earlier is shown. So the first character that we see here is young Stolas. Right away, we find out that it's his birthday, and then he's about to go find out his
purpose and responsibility
from his father. Enter Paimon, who is Stolas' father, and he probably has one of the coolest fucking character designs in the entire show. Like Stolas, Paimon is also a real Goetia demon. Interestingly, the Ars Goetia lists Paimon as King Paimon and Stolas as Prince Stolas, making the hierarchy in the show somewhat accurate to real demonology. I didn't find anything saying that Stolas was a son of Paimon though, but that's getting into nitpick territory, and I didn't even look that hard, so it actually could be true. Anyways, Paimon is presented as a cartoonishly played up version of your typical uncaring rich dad stereotype. I think it's rather interesting that despite having a massive elitist for a parent, Stolas grew up to not care much about class and has no problem interacting with imps, who are in the lowest class of hell. This is in contrast to Blitz, who grows up to be kind of an uncaring asshole like his dad. This point is illustrated nicely by the fact that Blitz gave into his dad's pressures, while Stolas had no issue with taking up an interest in an imp, despite his status and his dad's elitism. Anyways, Stolas is told that his responsibility will be to study the Earth's skies and also prophecies in the stars, which I feel like is foreshadowing for something that's going to happen later. In order to do his job, he's given the grimoire so he can access the sky. It's also implied that Stolas can command legions, which is also accurate to real demonology. Another thing that they imply is that there might be other grimoires controlled by other Goetia demons. This one is a bit of a reach because I'm basing this solely off of the fact that Paimon said your grimoire, which could possibly mean that there are others. It's just something to consider. After getting his grimoire, Stolas is told that he also has to provide the Goetia family with an heir, so he's now engaged to Stella. This makes him cry, so Paimon takes him to the circus to get him to stop. The fact that this marriage was arranged is definitive evidence that Stolas' marriage is definitely loveless, which, along with other stuff near the end of the episode, means a lot for this show, but more on that later. So Stolas arrives at the circus, and then we're introduced to Blitz and Fizzarelli. Immediately, we see that they're friends and that they both work at the circus together, which is information we already knew, but it's still pretty cool to see it in action. We also see Stolas' sister for half a second, which honestly made me think that the plot of this episode is going to be different than what we got. So Blitz fails to make a balloon horse in front of everyone, and yes, there are trans imps in the crowd, I already looked. And he quickly says this to recover.
Well, it was a horse, but then it ate too much sugar and its legs stopped working, so I had to amputate. Now it's a gross worm horse.
Then Fizz makes a perfect balloon horse, showing us that Fizz is probably better at his job than Blitz. But it's also showing us something else. It's showing us that while Fizz is better, Blitz is smart enough to come up with a rebuttal right away, showing us that he's kind of more street smart, which is in line with his personality. It's just a cool little detail. Also, throughout Blitz's performance, Stolas takes quite an interest in Blitz, blushing as hard as an Owl House character when he first sees him, and actually thinking that his joke that nobody else cared about was kinda funny. I can't tell if that blush was supposed to tell us that his interest in Blitz was a romantic one, because their relationship in the rest of the segment is clearly meant to be a friendship. Maybe it was just a bit of fan service, since the viewers know that Stolas eventually grew to love Blitz romantically, but I honestly don't know. So after the show, Paimon realizes that his son was very much enjoying Blitz, so he approaches Blitz's father in order to buy him.
That depends. How much money are we talking about?
Mr. Krabs!
62 cents. I'll take the money.
Mr. Krabs!
Here you go, Krabs. 62 cents.
Yeah, Blitz's dad is literally just an R-rated version of Mr. Krabs. You can't convince me otherwise. So, Blitz's dad comes to tell his son about the deal, and he also tells him to steal as much of the Goetia stuff as possible while he's there, as all their stuff is probably valuable. Blitz doesn't want to do this, but his dad pressures him into doing it. So Blitz and Stolas are hanging out now, and this is right about the point when I started thinking that there might be continuity error surfacing. The fact that Blitz and Stolas apparently used to be friends as young kids means that they knew each other prior to the events of the pilot. So I went back and watched the pilot to see if anything contradicted, and surprisingly, no, I didn't. I couldn't find anything here that said, or even implied really, that the events of the pilot were Blitz and Stolas' first interaction. That's pretty impressive, especially since it could mean that Viv already knew that this episode would be happening, and that it would play out in a way that would tie back into the pilot, so she had to write the pilot in a way that wouldn't clash with the backstory. I swear, if that's actually what happened, then I'm going to lose my mind, since that level of planning ahead and storytelling is just absurdly good. Right, so moving forward with the episode, Blitz is bored by Stolas' idea of fun, which is just reading books. So Blitz convinces Stolas to play a game called Treasure Hunt, which is literally just defenestrating Stolas' valuables. I'm so happy that I finally get to use that word, by the way. So they do that, and also something you might have noticed, but a more childlike version of the IMP theme is playing during the montage of them gathering the stuff.
Come on, come on!
Little details like this is what make the show so much better. It really does just go to show how much the people making it care about their productions. Anyways, after they eject the bag of valuables into Blitz's dad's waiting arms, this very wholesome scene of Blitz and Stolas bonding under a tree commences. They mostly talk about what they want to do when they grow up, and in Stolas' case, what he has to do when he grows up. We can also see a lot of the personality traits that Blitz has as an adult show through here, like his desire to govern his own future, be a business owner, and his love for horses. Also, Blitz finds out about Stolas' grimoire and its abilities, which is obviously important for later.
No, this is my new grimoire. It's a spell book. I have to learn it so that I can access the living world.
I gotta say, what an amazing start to this episode. This backstory is so compelling and gives us so much information in a remarkably effective, interesting to watch way. In 12 short minutes, this first segment weaves in countless details about these characters' backstories. We get to see how they met, how they interacted before we, the audience, knew them, and how the way they lived their lives before the events of the show affected them and turned them into the characters that we're familiar with. It hits all the right notes that a good origin story needs to. I can say that without a doubt, the first half of this episode was wonderful and is a great addition to the show's canon. After this segment, we get a time cut to another point in the characters' lives, right before the events of the pilot. So we jump forward to 25 years later, and we can immediately see that Stolas isn't doing great, as he wakes up sad and alone in bed. We also see that Blitz is now trying to get Stolas' grimoire. The point that Stolas isn't doing the best is shown even further when he comes downstairs and finds out that Stella is throwing a not-divorced party. The first thought I had when I saw this was, wow, that's not subtle, is it? But then I remembered this is a fucking cartoon, and things are played up in this show all the time. Also, it could be interpreted as a way to show us just how much of a bitch Stella actually is. So, in other words, never trust your past self because they're usually a dumb. Anyways, Stolas attends the party and hears his wife talking shit about him, and then some security guards come up to him, Blitz in hand, and tell Stolas that they caught him trying to sneak into his chambers. He did this to steal the grimoire, of course, but at this point, the only ones who know that are Blitz and the audience. Stolas doesn't find out what his true intentions were until after the book is taken. Stolas tells the guards to leave Blitz to him, and he takes him back to his room. Stolas then reveals that he thinks that Blitz is there to bang, and, while doing so, reveals some important information. So apparently he and Blitz have screwed before, and they actually haven't seen each other in over 2 decades.
I recall how you enjoy making an entrance. So, over 2 decades since I last saw you.
Now, I don't know how old Stolas and Blitz were supposed to be in the first segment, but combining an estimated age with what Stolas just said would mean that these two first got intimate when they were teens, or perhaps even younger, which, okay, even in hell, that's pretty f***ed up. I really hope that I'm somehow reading this wrong and that nothing like that actually happened in this show's storyline. Also, this scene is one of my biggest gripes about the entire episode. You're telling me that Stolas was willing to bang a childhood friend he hasn't seen in 20 plus years immediately after said childhood friend was just caught breaking into his room that's full of important and expensive shit? Like, Stolas really doesn't think that he was there for any other reason? Is sex really the only thing this man ever thinks about? Anyways, Blitz decides to play along as a means to the book, but this kind of backfires when Stolas gets cold feet and tries to pull out of Blitz's advances, making Blitz look like the one who's looking to bang. Despite this, Blitz manages to improvise enough to get the book, but in doing so, accidentally turns Stolas back onto him. Blitz is about to leave with the book, but then Stolas says this:
The one who wants me is my first ever friend.
This makes Blitz feel bad, so he decides to stay and screw Stolas just this one time. Then there's another time cut to the next morning, and this is when we find out something super interesting. All that stuff that just happened was actually what happened right before the flashback that we saw in the pilot of Blitz taking the book. This detail doesn't really have that much of an effect on anything in regards to the overarching story. It's mostly just here to give us a gauge of when this is taking place. But it's still a pretty cool detail that would be foolish to overlook. You know something else that would be foolish to overlook? How little sense this line makes.
That was the sound of a f***ing divorce!
Yeah, that ends up going absolutely nowhere, since they don't actually divorce until the end of the episode, which takes place in the present. They don't even separate or anything, at least not until after the events of episode 2, since all of Octavia's dialogue in that episode basically says that they're all still living under the same roof. Then again, this episode does say that they've split custody of Octavia, but Stella still stays around the house to torment Stolas. So since Octavia doesn't mention anything about that custody split in episode 2, that would mean that by then, they could either be separated or still together. There isn't enough information to determine which it is, so since they technically could have separated after he said this, this really isn't a continuity error. So, continuity error light, I guess? Damn, it really does seem like I'm reaching to find a hole in this now expanded timeline, even though it's been practically airtight so far. Really does just go to show how good of a job Viv actually did with handling this story. Anyways, I still don't really like the line, seeing as it doesn't cause him to divorce, and doesn't have that much of an impact on anything, even though I feel like the show wanted it to, seeing as this is the last scene that we see before the last time cut of the episode. But hey, if this one weird line is one of the only issues that I have with the episode so far, then I would say that it's a pretty amazing one. Hopefully there's nothing that I don't like about the episode's final segment to spoil this fantastic run it's been having so far. This segment is by far the shortest, and there's not really much here to talk about aside from the informational argument that we get at the end. It starts with Stolas waking up after passing out, presumably from drinking. He pops some normal pills and then launches into a song about Blitz and... Okay, that was kind of rude, but I'm gonna be honest, I really don't care that much about the songs in Helluva, mostly because they're typically short and not particularly memorable. I'm not saying that they're bad. I fully acknowledge Bryce Pinkham's vocal talent. You Will Be Okay was incredible after all. But this one, along with most of the other Helluva songs, really just isn't something I care too much about. If you're somebody who loves the songs in the show, then that's perfectly fine, and I'm sure you'll also like this one because it's kind of just like all the other ones. It's good, but not my thing. Right after he's done, things start getting interesting again. Stella comes out to be a bitch, and then this enormous blowout argument happens, which dumps a lot of information. The first thing we see is the implied separation and split custody thing that I mentioned before, as well as Stella saying that she just sticks around the palace to torment Stolas, showing us even more of her bitchiness. Then Stolas says that they were only married for the sole purpose of giving the Goetia family an heir, and that despite that, he's tried to make their family work, but Stella's bullshit has made it extremely difficult. Stolas then says that Stella has been brutally abusive, and that he only endured it for Octavia's sake. He then says that he just can't anymore, and that he wants her out of his life. He finishes by saying that they're getting that divorce for real. Stella then asks him what the rest of the Goetias would think, and she winds up to backhand him, which basically says that Stella is physically abusive as well. Before I continue, I'd like to point out the amazing timing of this scene in this episode. Much of the world is currently a lot more aware and sympathetic to male abuse victims after a huge victory for them in the Johnny Depp trial. So I think it's good that they're being represented in the media. As some more attention is called to the issue, the better. Again, bravo to Viv and her crew for representing issues that need to be talked about in a way that doesn't severely screw with the story. Hopefully mainstream Hollywood movies start doing this too. Anyways, Stolas grabs her hand before the strike lands and reiterates that the only thing that they need to do in their marriage is already done, therefore he's done too. Oh yeah, this argument also confirms that Octavia is still a minor, despite the canon Instagram lore stating otherwise. I don't know how much of the fandom considers the Instagram lore to be canon, but I personally don't. I'm of the belief that the show is where you should be getting your canon information from, and the show says that Octavia is 17.
Is already 17.
So that would make all of the Rule 34 of her on the internet 100% illegal. The worst part of that is that I know for a fact that certain fans of this show would probably fall back on the Instagram lore and say that its canon level outweighs the actual show just so that they can keep making lewd art. Stuff like that is the reason why I'm extremely wary of online fandoms. It seems like for the most part, ethics, morals, and basic respect just take a back seat in those fandoms. It's pretty gross. Moving on from that massive tangent, Stella agrees to the divorce, saying that she has no desire to stay with Stolas, as he's, as she put it, fallen from what little grace he had. She also says that he'll pay for it, which is probably foreshadowing the Striker coming back to try and take Stolas out again. Stella storms off, and then the episode ends. Wow, what a good episode. I can't believe that it managed to be both informative and entertaining as well as it did. Providing backstory information about characters in a compelling way is no easy task, but this episode just does it so well. There's really not much else to say here that I didn't already say in other parts of the video. Viv and her crew managed to create a fantastic origin story that gave us more context for events that already happened in the show, and showed us a lot of a story that honestly feels like it has been happening almost entirely in the background, despite how interesting it is. It's even more impressive when you consider that they did all that under the circumstances surrounding Helluva's production at the time. I've seldom seen a creative group cope with a shift in production this monumental this well. It really is a testament to their dedication to create something amazing, despite the bullshit that gets in the way. This episode takes the idea that Helluva Boss is nothing but an episodic, comedic sideshow and completely demolishes it. It took all these underdeveloped or one-note characters and gave them a whole new dimension, as well as building on their already established traits. It also ties together events that happened in previous episodes, showing that there is an overarching story here, and that events from other episodes can't just be overlooked or forgotten. This episode did wonders for the characters involved as well. We get to see so much more of Stolas and Stella here, and that insight into their dynamic and overall personalities makes the events of the past episodes make a lot more sense. We now understand why Stolas cheated, and we see how Stella's abuse contributed towards him making that choice. We see just how much he cares for Octavia and what he's actually done for her. We see how his romantic relationship with Blitz started, and what made Blitz go along with it. We see them as kids, and what their home lives were like, and how it aided in shaping them into the people that they are now. We find out some information about the reproductive systems of owl creatures in hell. This episode really has everything, and its inclusion here does a great job in making these characters feel dynamic and real, as opposed to just having one dominant trait. It does almost everything right, and it is now one of my favorite episodes in the show. This episode is an easy 8.5 out of 10, possibly a 9 or higher. Hats off to everyone who worked on this thing. And with that, I am all done. If you enjoyed the video, please be sure to subscribe, like, comment, and share it around. Bye.